The store continues to be a center of civil discourse under the leadership of Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine and the wonderful Politics and Prose staff. And tonight is a special occasion of being able to welcome back Elizabeth Sifton and Fritz Stern for their magnificent book, No Ordinary Men, which is, of course, about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Hans von Dohnanyi, who were resistors against Hitler in church and state. And we will hear from them. They will have a conversation with each other. They will move back and forth. So it will be a special occasion that way as well. I wanted to do this introduction for lots of reasons, and I recently attended a 70th anniversary commemoration of the Danish resistance of the Nazis. And we were reminded that evening about how significant 1943 was as a year in the fight against Hitler, the Warsaw Uprising, the beginning of the White Rose movement, the important events surrounding Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Hans von Dohnanyi. And in addition, as I had a chance to tell both Elizabeth Sifton and Fritz Stern, they were a tremendous influence on Carla and me in the books that they organized, the books that they wrote, the ideas they conveyed. Very, very special, and it became a very important part of our own family life, their work. In No Ordinary Men, you are capturing the importance of memory, correcting its omissions, as I'm sure we'll hear, and reminding us that stands of morality come from within, and they are not isolated. It's no accident that these two men work together. And while I hesitate and won't use the word collaborator, it is full of cooperation and mutuality. And it helps us grapple with issues, with moral issues and their complexity. You cite it towards the end of the book, the British Bishop Bell, who made a wonderful statement in a tribute to Dietrich Bonhoeffer in England after the war. And what Bonhoeffer said what Bell said was, Bonhoeffer's heroic resistance represents both the resistance of the believing soul in the name of God and also the moral and political revolt of the human conscience against injustice and cruelty. That tribute applies equally to Hans von Dohnanyi. So let us tonight welcome Elizabeth Sifton and Fritz Stern to Politics and Prose again. Thank you.
The reason I'm starting is because I'm the one who got the phone call from Robert Silvers, legendary editor of the New York Review of Books, and as it happens, an old friend of ours. 3 years ago, he called up and he said, Elizabeth, I hope you won't find this offensive or peculiar, but I would like you and Fritz to write something together, which we had never done. Well, I said, what? I mean, what have you got in mind? Offensive? Peculiar? And he said, well, there are a couple of new books about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we think you should review them. So I said, let me ask Fritz. I'm sure he'll want to, and I'd be happy to, too. And we got the books. He sent us the books. And we called him back. I called him back, and I said, Bob, one of these books is so bad that you don't want to have it reviewed. It should not be dignified with a review in the New York Review. And the other one is okay, but it's kind of not very interesting. And both of them rely heavily on a very well-known, monster, big biography of Bonhoeffer that was first published in the 1960s, and then most recently in the revised edition runs to almost 800 pages in 1970. And he said, well, this was written by Eberhard Bethke, for those of you who know your Bonhoeffer scholars. And he said, well, we never reviewed the Bethke book, so you can put that one in there too. Okay, fine. So we began work on it, and we found it very hard to do what he wanted us to do, which was to assess the value and importance of the books and of their subject. And the reason we found it very difficult to do was because we felt that somehow focusing just on Dietrich and just on the work that he did within the church, and then toward the end, after the war broke out, in collaboration with his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, was somehow not in focus. You couldn't see really what the real story was, we thought. And we thought the real stories had something important to say about the nature of the German resistance, a subject that wasn't believed to exist when Eberhard Bethge first wrote his early work on Bonhoeffer. And we thought it was a dishonor also to Hans von Dohnanyi, because he was, in his way, just as extraordinary as famous Dietrich is in his way. And the two of them becoming such close friends and collaborators and colleagues, and risking their lives, and in fact giving up their lives, to fight against the destruction of the church and of law and the state in Germany, we thought was a story that had to be told properly. And reviewing books on just the one of them wasn't going to do the trick. So Bob said, well, why don't you go ahead and write about that? And we did, and it got a little bit longer than a book review, you know what I mean? And so it became the book. Well, we had never planned to do this to begin with. I mention that because there are discoveries we made along the way, even though most of the facts were pretty well known to us, I think. No, not the ones about Hans. But the quality that the two men shared that we wanted to make much of, and I hope we have, is this. They were extremely modest and straightforward. And in this respect, they reminded me of my parents' friends, whom I knew as a child growing up in New York in the 40s and 50s. Many of their best friends were Europeans who had been colleagues of theirs in anti-Hitler work or in the ecumenical movement, which was an important part of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life also. And I remember those people with great love and admiration. They were modest, hardworking, unpretentious, and unpious, if you know what I mean. They didn't brandish their Christian commitments and credentials, but they were serious, good people who did serious good work during the Nazi period and during the war and thereafter. And they were wonderful, lively, interesting people, and very modest. I learned from my parents, therefore, that you always had to be on the guard if somebody began saying something like this. Speaking as a Christian, I would say that you knew right away that this was not a person whose spiritual life you wanted to know much about. So you can imagine how interested I was when decades later, I mean, from the time that I knew that, and years before we started work on this little book together, we had in our house, thanks to Fritz's efforts in making this happen, two extremely interesting Germans who were in New York to attend the opening of a exhibition about to preside over the opening of an exhibition concerning the 20th of July plot against Hitler. This was an exhibition organized and supervised by the Bundeswehr itself, which was remarkable because in the first years after the war, those men were not treated as heroes but as traitors. So for the modern German army to be saying that these men represented the best of the German military tradition was major. So Klaus Naumann, then chief of staff of the German army, and shortly to become head of NATO forces in Europe, was there. And there was another Klaus. This was Klaus von Dohnanyi, who was one of Hans's sons. The other son is the Christoph who conducts in Cleveland, if you know what I mean. And so they were talking about the event. They came to our house and we opened some champagne and had a nice time with them. And they were talking about the event that they had just been at, with the opening of this exhibit. And Hans Dohnanyi became pensive and said very quietly, I feel uncomfortable when I hear my father being described as such a hero. He never thought of himself as a hero. He didn't like that kind of way of talking. And I thought, oh, I know what he's talking about. This is exactly the moral quality that I had also found in the people that I had known as a child who had been, as it were, graduates in the School of Resistance. And he emphasized this very strongly, Klaus did. And in all the work we did subsequently about his father, Hans, we saw that was absolutely the case. Absolutely the case. So the easy way of praising these men as heroes who fought against Hitler is not, to our mind, the right way to praise them. You can't praise them enough, but that's not the right way. So we tried to suggest in what ways they did do what they did and suggest the right way to talk about it.
I was, for any number of reasons, enormously interested. Having grown up under National Socialism for between the ages, I think, of 7 and 12, I thought resistance, which I knew about as a child, and all the trials and difficulties and horrors associated with the resistance had always fascinated me. Then to have a chance to write about these two men, of whom Bonhoeffer came from a very, very distinguished medical family, as did my parents, and my parents and grandparents were friends of the old Bonhoeffer. The old Bonhoeffer was Germany's preeminent psychiatrist and had started out in the same city where my parents and grandparents had done their medical work, Breslau, now Wrocław in Poland, and so there was very much of a connection to the family. All of this made it just imperative, quite aside from the fact that I found it more and more as we got into it, utterly, what should I say, awesome, humiliating to be able to write about these wonderful people, because that's what they were, from the word go. And I want to come back to this question of the word go. And so I happily joined Elizabeth in the task. And in a certain sense, a task it was. Bonhoeffer was, as Elizabeth can tell much better than I can, far better known in certain circles, both here and in Germany. And Dohnanyi was hardly known. And yet, as I say, as Elizabeth already said, what united them was that from the word go, they understood the evil that was coming upon Germany. And I mean from February 33 on, each had made a fleeting compromise with the regime, a fleeting gesture of acceptance, of no particular importance, except to their own conscience. And I came across that, and I felt this is what steeled them. They saw how easy it was to accommodate once, and they, I think, from that moment on, understood even more importantly not to do. One has to resist that at all costs. And let me say about Hans von Dohnanyi, who is not well known. He came from in his own way, from a distinguished family, the musician, and married Dietrich Bonhoeffer's sister. And I just want to add something that both Elizabeth and I feel very, very strongly. That woman, Christina von Dohnanyi, Christina Bonhoeffer, was simply a model of courage, decency, as they all were, and a most wonderful, impressive woman in helping both her brother-in-law when they were imprisoned, and in her own being, magnificent. So that actually, fortunately, she survived. She was arrested briefly, but she survived the horror. But as I say, it was I found it a kind of humiliating or humbling experience to write about such magnificent people under such terrible circumstances. And some of the circumstances I knew something about. And so Hans von Dohnanyi, to make it short, had in front of him a distinguished legal career, in government or outside of government, whatever he chose. He was known to be an extremely bright person of great integrity, a Democrat, incidentally, at the end of Weimar, of whom there were very few, and he was one of them. And from the very beginning, he was in the Ministry of Justice, and the Nazis continued the conservative Ministry of Justice that existed. He therefore had access to early information about what was going on, knew about the atrocities, kept for himself and for later uses something that came to be called the Chronicle of Shame. That is to say, the actual indecencies, the actual violations of law and human behavior that the Nazis were guilty of, and put them in a safe that belonged to the Wehrmacht, and that was supposed to be safe. As the story unfolds, it turned out not to be entirely safe, not to be safe. But in any case, from the very beginning then, the Chronicle of Shame, and as you can imagine, the Chronicle of Shame grew longer and longer, and one of the points that I was particularly keen to make very clear is that there is a connection between the German resistance, about which we now have a great many books, and the persecution of the Jews. One of them being that the resistors, some of the resistors, not all of them by any means, but some of them were appalled, were moved to go in the direction of resistance and opposition because of what they knew was happening to the Jews. The degradation, the sadistic degradation of the Jews. This is unacceptable to somebody like Dohnanyi, who believed in the sanctity of law. And just as a final comment until Elizabeth comes back, the Nazis were cunning in so many different ways. Cunning in the exploitation of their enemies, cunning in their manipulation of opinion, as we well know, but also cunning in establishing what somebody once called a legal dictatorship, so that lawyers could pretend that things were more or less legal that was going on, and that made it harder, obviously, to resist. One final comment on my part about the uniqueness of resistance, which also comes out, I think, in what we write about. The great professional associations, which we have too, the Bar Association, the Medical Association, obviously the clergies in different parts, and so on. They all, in their way, and very quickly submitted to the regime, and became all the harder, if you were a lawyer and if you were a doctor, to go not only against, so to speak, against the state and the popular, but against your own colleagues, against the people that you're living with, and so on. All of this, as I say, was made manifest in the life of Dohnanyi.
I wanted to read you just one little thing that Christina wrote. She was arrested on the same day that her husband and her brother were arrested in April 1943, and she was sent to prison where she was kept for several weeks and then was eventually released. And on Easter Sunday, April 25th, 1943, she wrote to her children. This is not the complete letter, this is excerpts from it. My beloved children, Father is completely alone, and so I always write to him and have asked him to write to you. My thoughts are always with you, and in addition, I have time like never before in my life, to be alone with all my thoughts. I read a lot, and I also go for walks, nicely back and forth in front of my window. In the cell, I eat from a white enameled bowl, such as I have never had at home. Everything is always right at hand for me, because everything is either on the table or in the suitcase. I should like to introduce this at home. And in general, one sees how good it is when one has few needs. Remember that, not for jail, but for life. Now, I want to tell you one more thing. Don't carry any hate in your heart against the power that has done this to us. Don't fill your young souls with bitterness. That has its revenge and takes from you the most beautiful thing there is, which is trust. Believe me, when one has experienced this, then one knows that it's, after all, only a really small, meager part of the human being that one can put in jail. I embrace all of you. Is that a mother? I mean, absolutely incredible kind of tone. And I think that's a tone that was typical of this whole family. One subject that I got very interested in, and of course couldn't write about because this isn't part of this book, but you want to know how these children were raised. And the famous Dr. Bonhoeffer, the psychiatrist's wife, who homeschooled all the children until they were 8, and then sent them off to gymnasia here and there, has to have been an absolutely extraordinary woman. She was quite devout, but her husband wasn't. So there weren't ritual Christian ceremonies at home, but there were prayers every night, and there was some awareness of her spiritual life, but a great openness to lots of different ways of expressing it. Dietrich's older brothers thought it was ludicrous that he was going into the church. They thought it was petty bourgeois and boring. And she didn't criticize them, and she didn't criticize Dietrich for going into the church. She kept them all as faithful, good children. I'd like to know a lot more about her parenting, but that takes us far afield, except it doesn't take us far afield, because she and her husband were with all these people through the war years in Berlin, helping each other, giving each other succor and food and messages and information. The information was, of course, about the continuing efforts to see if one could remove Hitler from power. Not at first to kill him, but simply to depose him. And Christina was in an important position to be able to give her brother and her husband some information which she got from their colleagues who were working on these matters. Some people have asked us, and we may not have made this clear enough in the book, how come they could write all these letters? How did they get away with that? And the answer is that with a letter like the one I just read to you, those were letters that she knew the guards would see. So she wrote it carefully with that in mind. But there were other letters that she and Hans and Dietrich were able to write that got smuggled out. And those are, of course, even more astonishing. The most amazing of all is one that Hans wrote to her. He was very sick, and he was in the military prison hospital, and it was February, March 1945. And they kind of knew that the end was coming and that Hitler would be defeated, but they were also in mortal danger themselves, still in prison. And he wrote her a long, ardent letter on pieces of thin cardboard that were the bottoms of coffee cups. He wrote in tiny little writing, 23 sides, I think it is. And it's two things. It's an ardent love letter to this marvelous woman, and it's a detailed description or instruction to her as to how he's thinking about what they must do. If this happens, they must do that. If that happens, we must above all remember. In other words, he's still thinking about how to get past the evil forces that have imprisoned him with unbounded energy and confidence. He'd been in prison for 2 years. So this tone about them was important to us to underline, and I hope that we have. There are many, many specific issues, and this is why we're happy to answer questions, many, many specific issues about aspects of their political work, their overtures to what the Nazis described as enemies, and we would say the Allied forces whom they hoped would support a new regime were they to succeed in removing Hitler. There are many other political issues involved in their enterprise, in their opposition in the state. In the church, it's also a long and difficult contrary story, and it sometimes drives you nuts. And it drove Dietrich nuts too, because the Nazis were fighting anti-Nazi forces within the church at every level, at the village level, at the town level, at the state level, at the district level. I mean, there were maneuvers being made against the non-compliant pastors for 12 solid years. So it was very hard and dispiriting work, and Dietrich was extraordinarily good at it. But he now and again got fed up, and then he would go off and he would do what he really loved to do, which was to be a pastor and to look after people in his pastorate and train his students to be pastors themselves. And that nourished him and kept him going. So one way or another, they all helped each other stay nourished and to keep going. And I dare not correct Professor Stern on the historical fact, but the fact is that they not only were at the word go in February 1933, they were anti-Hitler even before that. One of the reasons they were so... just adding. It's true. They were anti-Nazi from the early Weimar years. There's a very poignant letter that Klaus Bonhoeffer, Christina's another one of her brothers. There were 8 children. Klaus is also a lawyer, and he wrote to his fellow law student Hans von Dohnanyi in 1923, describing the sort of loutish, thuggish behavior of Nazi law students then in 1923. And he said, "Oh, Hans, think what trouble we're going to have with these people." So the story begins way back, probably even before the First World War, and it goes on after 1945 when these 2 noble men were killed. Because what happened to their families and to their survivors is not a pretty picture at all. And the state of the German soul in the late 1940s and 50s is not a very pretty picture. And we had to cover that too, because it takes into account some of the reasons why sometimes Bonhoeffer is overpraised as a great Protestant hero for reasons having to do with guilt about how badly they had behaved beforehand. And not only beforehand, but in the immediate post-war years.